Hello, everybody. We're here to talk about psychoanalytic criticism today. And before I really talk about what goes into doing a reading of literature in psychoanalysis, I just have a few things to say about the quote unquote field itself. Um, I just want to stress that what I'm teaching here is a method of reading literature, and we're going to be using terms and ideas from psychoanalysis to do that. Psychoanalysis is not a viable psychological theory that's used in psychology today. This is, the ideas of Sigmund Freud, and they were carried over by some other people and adapted and have influenced psychology. But you're not going to go to a psychologist and get psychoanalyzed. And my wife is a psychologist, and I've talked to her about this quite a bit. And in the field of psychology, you'll be familiar with Freud as somebody who is a historical figure who was responsible for kind of starting psychology as a field and came up with some concepts to be used. But the field has moved way beyond any of this kind of stuff, even though there's some influence, like just the idea that childhood can affect you later on. That's Freudian, and there are a lot of like large, just broad Freudian ideas that have carried on to psychology as large concepts, but there's no way that they're using this today. We're looking at this textbook for class, and I just feel like I wanted to stress that because Lois Tyson, I disagree with some of the things in this book, and she talks about psychoanalysis as if it's a thing in our current day, and it really is not. So be careful when you're reading this chapter to just take it with a grain of salt when it comes to that. We're talking just about how to use it in literature. So there's a basic set of terms and concepts that can be very useful in reading literature, and they're easy to understand because they've all become sort of part of pop culture. And I think that's the reason why most classes that you take are probably going to start with talking about psychoanalysis as a theory that is used in literature. Actually, other than the introduction, the first chapter in this book is about psychoanalysis. So now we're going back to that chapter because I think it can be useful. It's really easy to integrate these concepts. When you're talking about fictional characters, it can be really interesting and fun and enlightening to try to figure out their psychology. There are literary theorists who are against using psychoanalysis because they say it's not right to try to get into the psyche or to psychoanalyze a fictional character that isn't real. My response to that is I feel like it's completely okay because you're not going to want to psychoanalyze a living human being. That would be unethical at this point. And a fictional character is not real, and you're not going to hurt them in any way by applying these sometimes kind of crazy concepts to them. And that's what literature is for us to learn. So I think it can be a really good tool, and you can use it in the ways that you want to use it. And I tend to stay away from certain parts that I think are just overly nuts. But I don't want you to be too influenced by me because those things that I think are crazy and kind of embarrassing could also be something that someone else thinks works really well. And they could prove it to me that it works really well. So I'm open to that. So Tyson does acknowledge that Freud's ideas were like speculative and that he was just beginning something and wanted people to continue to develop it. So she's not completely naive of the fact that these are some kind of crazy ideas. But I think that she needed to, emphasize that a little bit more. So the first part of this chapter is talking about Sigmund Freud and his psychoanalysis. And then the second part is talking about Jacques Lacan. So here's another thing. I'm just going to put a little disagreement out there. Lois Tyson says that Sigmund Freud, classical psychoanalysis, is sort of like the standard by which literary theorists will usually look at literature, and that Jacques Lacan is more on the fringes in the world of literature and not used as much. I think I disagree with that. I think that nowadays Jacques Lacan is very prominent as a theorist who people use for reading, and Freud not so much. I think people use Freudian ideas, but they don't necessarily call it a psychoanalytic reading. it's really easy to use Freudian ideas and just not call it anything. You're just trying to get into the psyche of the characters, right? So let's talk about the Freud part. The useful things and the things that I think are going to bring a lot of value to your reading. I don't want to just like badmouth all this stuff because it's useful. So the unconscious is kind of what all of this centers around. This is, by the way, like the idea of the unconscious, affecting you is something major that Freud brought to the field of psychology that is still foundational today. So, when I say that Freud is outdated, I don't want it to make it seem like I think he's useless, right? So we are driven by desires and conflicts within us and fears that we have and patterns that we've developed unconsciously. So the unconscious is causing us to do things and we're not even necessarily most of the time realizing that it's causing us to do those things. That's important and that's really useful when reading literature because you want to try to figure out like how can I explain what's going on here, right? So what you want to do is be looking for patterns of behavior. When we're looking at being driven by the unconscious, it's not just, you can't just take one thing that happened and say, oh, the unconscious drove me to this and here's the reason why. What you want to do is look for patterns in behavior, which is like a great thing to do when you're reading literature anyway, and try to explain those patterns of behavior. So this is very character driven, right? If you can do that by thinking about what's on this character's mind that they might not realize is on their mind, that is really interesting stuff, right? The idea of repression is important here. So the thing that causes patterns of behavior, like destructive patterns of behavior, is what we're talking about, is repressed memories. So if you don't want to face something, it goes into your subconscious, but then it still messes with you, right? So it can cause these patterns of bad behavior, or at least like dysfunctional or difficult behavior. So Tyson uses some classical Freudian examples where, like, if you have a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a partner, and you have this pattern of bad behavior with them, maybe you can look to, like, if you have a husband who you're in a bad relationship with, look to your father and see what kind of things happened there, and you can connect those two. Now, this tends to get very sort of gender normative and things like that. It's always, wife to mother, husband to father, but like, you have the freedom to expand the horizons of this and think about gender however you tend to think about gender, and think about the different possibilities, and it doesn't have to be so normative, and you can still think about these interactions that are either authoritatively charged or sexually charged, or some sort of relationship dynamic that is in a person's subconscious that's coming out, causing patterns. So remember, it's all about the patterns. You don't have to get all Oedipal with this. You don't have to, this idea that men want to have sex with their mother and kill their father. That's the classic part of this classic theory, right? You don't have to go there. And in fact, I think a lot of times theorists today, critics today, they're going to kind of go, ew, it's been done. And there are more interesting things I think we can do. So the idea, though, is that past experiences, especially negative ones, can become repressed memories and can be like influencing how somebody acts. And you can look for evidence for what they're doing in the book. And if you do have some background on that character, you can connect that too. But like, you can be really thinking about how can these patterns psychologically be explained. There's a section in this chapter called Defenses, Anxiety, and Core Issues. I found that to be a really useful section when I was thinking about how to directly apply this to literature. So the idea here is that defenses, key term, defenses, these are things that we do to try to keep our repressed memories and feelings repressed. So to try to keep them from having to face them. You can be thinking of these in terms of some of the vocabulary that's thrown out, like selective perception. So a character might be seeing what they want to see. Different ways of remembering things. Memory is inconsistent and memory isn't real. It doesn't work right in a story, right? Denial, avoidance, displacement. So like, taking something out on someone else and you want to try to figure out why that's happening, fear of intimacy, all these different things. These can be ways that people are avoiding or repressing, keeping these things repressed. So what's the thing that's being repressed is referred to as the core issue. So another key term here is core issue. So the core issue is that thing, that icky, bad, negative thing that the person experienced and is having a hard time facing, right? And it's in the subconscious rather than the conscious, but it's affecting how you're operating. So if you one interesting thing you can do for a reading would be like thinking about what's the core issue here, right? Can you figure it out, or can you speculate about it in a way that you think might be sort of accurate? Is there a pattern of behavior here, and what might be the core issue that's causing this person to behave that way? It could make for some good readings. One of the things that's addressed pretty specifically in this chapter and in psychoanalysis is dreams. Dreams were really taken up, dreams use symbols instead of reality, right? Those were really taken up by Carl Jung, who studied with Freud. Carl Jung is not mentioned in this chapter, but if you ever want to go out and think about symbolism, like pretty heavily about symbolism, that's the realm of Carl Jung. Very interesting stuff. We're not going to get into that. We can't get into everybody, but just keep that author or that thinker in mind if you want to really think about dreams and really think about archetypal symbols and things like that. Anyway, though, dreams are in psychoanalysis a lot, right? They're a big part of it. So since dreams deal in symbols instead of reality, you can start to interpret those symbols. Now, of course, in psychoanalysis, every symbol is penises and vaginas and sometimes breasts, right? And that's like, it's a big thing for Freud. You can find that stuff and you can interpret that way. And that can be a really useful reading if you're trying to figure out sexual ideas within, the story. But not everything has to be phallic. Not everything has to be sort of associated with a womb, and it doesn't have to be that heteronormative and all that stuff, right? You can think of other things that seem to be symbols. If you're seeing imagery in something that you're reading and it seems, it might be an actual dream sequence, and you can be like, okay, these are dream symbols. Let me come up with what makes sense within the text that I can see these things are saying, right? It doesn't have to be literally within a dream sequence. So many of the things that we read have abstract parts that are supposed to be sort of dreamy or sort of reflective or just not quite just in the realist realm, right? That's everything. So many things we have that. So when things are a little bit off, a little bit strange, a little bit dreamy, think about what's going on and think about it symbolically. And you can even do this for parts that aren't dreamy. You might be able to find symbols because, it's a piece of art, right? And a piece of art is not strictly real. It's symbolic of something, right? So if you can find elements that are happening in the story that seem to be, that you think you can interpret symbolically rather than literally, that is part of psychoanalysis. That's part of when we bring it into the literary realm, not necessarily the original classical psychoanalysis, right? Death is another thing that is talked about a lot in psychoanalysis. Freud uses this term death drive, and it's sort of this idea that we're kind of obsessed with death. We're thinking about it all the time, and we're also, even though it scares us a lot, we're really fascinated with it. So the fact that we can't just like knock it off with all this death stuff is the death drive. We just keep on with it, right? So death can be, and you'll think about this literarily, death can be literally someone dies and you want to figure out what this death in the story means. What the person who's in mourning, what does it mean that they're in a certain kind of mourning that they're in? What does it mean for the story that this person has died and is out of the story, right? Death can also mean things that are a little bit less literal. So it can mean something in life that you just can't face. So this will be, related to all this core issues and stuff that we're talking about, right? But this, death themes in something can speak to that. Death might also be something like, like you're afraid of being left alone. Being left alone is sort of like death, right? Or there's something major in your life that's ending. and you're not literally dying, but something is stopping to, ceasing to be. Um, Death can also mean just general loss. So you can be thinking abstractly about these things and using psychoanalysis to try to figure out what's the message here in this book, in this story, in this poem. Death is also related to violence, and violence is part of the death drive, something that we just can't knock it off with this violence. We just are obsessed with it, right? Really fascinated by it. So you can be thinking in terms of violence. You can be thinking in terms of fear of death. You can be thinking in terms of something ending that is profound, all kinds of stuff, and this all has to do with the death drive. And so these are things that Tyson's doing a really good job in this book of explaining in really simple terms. So of course, sex is really central to anything Freudian. I personally get really annoyed with the way Freud sexualizes everything. I mean, he sexualizes babies even, with their different stages, the oral stage, the anal stage. And again, I think if you were going to start doing some of that classical stuff in a literary analysis, a lot of people just go, ew, why, so I think we're kind of past that right now, especially since, people study in real psychology. People study babies and they don't sexualize babies when they're studying them. You can understand, babies in a lot of more reasonable ways now. But the idea that sex is central is important here, and it can be a really good tool to use in books, especially when you're talking about relationships. Freud positions sex opposite to death. So death he describes as like the death drive. Sex he calls that eros, borrowing a term. And so it's just like, I'm not a huge fan of this dichotomy. It kind of works. It kind of makes sense though, right? Because one is continuing life, one is ending life, and all the different symbolic occurrences of those things too, even if they aren't literal. I think, it gets kind of, according to Freud, it seems like we're always, killing or fucking, but if you can just set those things that annoy me aside, you can see that these dualities can do a lot for when you're reading literature. So that's, a lot of the stuff that she said on Freud. Make sure you're just reading it yourself, because I'm just kind of giving you an overview of some terms and how you might think of them when you want to apply them to reading literature. She also talks about Jacques Lacan. And again, I feel like Jacques Lacan is more difficult to understand, but people in academia like to use him more than they like to use Freud, partly because he is difficult to understand. And literary theorists, people in literature who want to write about literature, really enjoy making things as difficult to understand as possible. That really is a thing, and I'm sorry about that. But also Lacan has some really useful ideas. He was confusing and inconsistent throughout his entire career. His whole career was kind of like this exploration where he kept changing and revising what he thought, which I think is commendable. It prevented him from being a prominent person in psychology at all, but it caused him to be pretty prominent in like literature and in, different philosophy studies and things like that. People do find a lot of interest in him. I want to just be looking at the book a little bit while I'm talking about this. So Lacan's big thing is he does think about babies, but in a really productive, interesting way. So the whole thing here is that when you're a baby, you don't have language yet. And you don't understand that you're separate from the rest of the world. So you have this sense of unity with the whole world, and for him, particularly with the mother. So a baby doesn't realize that the mother and itself and the environment are all separate things. So what happens is the baby moves into realizing that it's separate from the world and that it's separate from its mother. And that is something that like causes this rift in a personality, and it affects us for our entire life after that. So in the beginning, he talks about a couple of different realms here. So we have the imaginary and the symbolic. We need to think of these two things as two different parts of ourselves, but two different stages that we experience. So the imaginary, it's not imaginary as in it's not real. It's imaginary as in it's made of images. So the imaginary is what you experience when you're a baby. And everything is an image to you. You don't have any language to explain it. So you have this sense of unity, and you have a sense of control over your life because you haven't you don't yet understand what all these conflicts are. You're just experiencing the visual world through images. As you start to learn language, you start to move into the symbolic realm. So Lacan is using the word symbolic maybe in a little bit different way from what you're accustomed to. He's using it in the way that like linguists and post-structuralists use it in. We will be studying post-structuralism in a little while in this class, and I love it. It's very, very literary, very language oriented. So he's in this realm already, right? So the symbolic idea is that language is made of symbols. As soon as you start using language to describe the world around you, you're not experiencing it directly anymore. You're creating a symbol for that. So a word is a symbol for the thing, right? So when you understand something through words, you're understanding the words, and then the thing kind of falls into the background a little bit and becomes separate from it. It disjoints you from reality in a certain way. And that's just like, this is a huge language theory that just permeates linguistics and literature and philosophy. So this is a huge, huge, big, real thing that Lacan is sort of in the middle here. So some of the ways that these things operate is a baby is living in the imaginary. Everything is one. But then there's this idea of the mirror. So the concept of the mirror is important. So a baby might literally see itself in a mirror and start to realize, oh, that's me. I can see my whole self. I'm different from what's all around me. It doesn't have to be a literal mirror. He also thinks about a mirror as like the mother. He's very, very mother oriented. I realize this could be father or otherwise, right? This could be caretaker, whoever they're closest to. So again, this is real sort of sexist, heteronormative, but like we'll stick with the terms for now. But you can adapt this however you think about it. So the mother mirrors the child's behavior, and the child starts to see the mother doing things and realizes that she's imitating him or her, right? And that child, it's a mirror effect because the child's behavior is mirrored in what the mother is doing. So through all these different processes, the baby starts to move out of the imaginary order and into the symbolic order, where things are separate and there are words for things. Let me just take a look at some of these things here I wanted to mention. So the idea is that it's a great loss when you move from this. When you're at one with your mother or your caretaker, and you're at one with the whole world, and you feel safe and you feel like you have control, as soon as you start learning that you're separate from it and then start expressing things through language, it represents a great loss, because now all of a sudden we have to put up with ideologies and conflict and feeling disconnected from things. And on some level, for the rest of our lives, we're always longing to get back to this symbolic order where everything is at peace and everything is in unity. We can never get back there because we're stuck in a world of language and ideology, right? So a lot of things can happen. The imaginary order never leaves us. We don't transition out of it and leave it behind. We have to live in the symbolic order. We have to live our lives in a life of ideology and language and separateness. But somewhere in the backgrounds of our subconscious, the imaginary order is still operating. We still have it somewhere, and we can get glimpses of it. So sometimes when you have this sense of euphoria, or you have this sense everything's going to be okay, or you have a revelation or something, you're kind of in touch with that symbolic order again. So really what we're thinking about here is we develop an unconscious because we start to have memories and we start filing our memories away, and then our unconscious is this fractured thing, and we're fractured from it, and it's a great sense of loss, and our whole life we're sort of longing for a sense of unity again. So metaphor and metonymy are two concepts that Lois Tyson brings up here, and she's absolutely right. Metaphor and metonymy, when you're talking about not just Lacan, but about all of these ideas that language gives us a fragmented existence. Metaphor is substituting one thing for another. Metonymy is substituting one part for a whole, right? So they're both about substitutions, and language itself is a substitution, because you're not experiencing the thing at hand anymore. You're experiencing the word for it, or the phrase for it, or the symbol of it. That's why we call it the symbolic, right? So we think in symbols rather than in quite like being in touch with reality. So whenever you see metonymy or metaphor, those are two of the largest driving um, concepts in literature, and you're always going to be want to look for those, and you can like get really deep into those when you find them and do a really good literary analysis by trying to unravel those things. Um, what else do I want to say about this? Um, that's kind of like the thrust, I think, the big crux of what you can be doing with Lacan on a basic level. You can study Lacan, and oh, there's one more thing that maybe I should. There is this idea called the real, and it's kind of a scary thing, and it's also something that Lacan is kind of famous for not being able to really explain. But the real is sort of what the world really is, but we can never see it. We understand the world through concepts, through symbols, through language, right? So we're out of touch with the way the world really is. If our ideologies aren't guiding us, then we have nothing. And we know that the world exists without our ideologies, but we can't comprehend it because our ideology is the only way that our ideologies and language, which are closely connected, are the ways that we understand things, right? So it's kind of terrifying that there's this thing out there that doesn't have any, it exists and we're part of it, but we can't see it. Um, so this is again part of the drive that we have, that we just want to have this unity. We don't want to be afraid anymore, right? So Lois Tyson doesn't recommend using Lacan for students. She just wanted to put it in here to give like an understanding. I say if you want to use Lacan, use Lacan. It's going to be difficult, but why not, right? That's what we're here for. If you want to experiment with it, I'm going to be pretty happy with that. If you can get some kind of coherence, it doesn't have to be perfect, but start working with it, right? Because these early assignments are kind of like exercises. Um, the main thing we're thinking about here with both Freud and Lacan is that the unconscious is powerful, and the unconscious in some way, whether you're talking about all the terms that I talked about with Freud, so think about all those different terms and try to think of maybe one term that you can use and center a reading around it. Or if you're talking about Lacan, where you're talking about moving into this fractured realm of the symbolic and how that affects you with longing to be out of the symbolic, whichever way you want to go, it's going to be something that you can play with a lot. I think I lost my train of thought there a little bit. So if I was kind of coming to a point that I missed, I'm sorry. But what I really want to say here is that you can take these ideas and use them how you want. There's a lot of freedom here. And the main thing is you want to be thinking about how characters are motivated by things from within them. And you want to be trying to figure out some kind of pattern that you can express when you're trying to decipher a reading. So Tim O'Brien is the one you'll be reading for this. You'll notice I'm trying to put a lot of interesting and easy to read and fun readings here to use as object texts, so you can have some fun using this theory on them. So I think that this chapter, I'm having you read a chapter of the things I carried, called On the Rainy River, I think is what the chapter is. There's a lot of anxiety, ripe for psychoanalytic reading. There's a lot of talk about family. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of thinking about death. There's just a pretty good amount of stuff that I think you can mine and try to make sense of through a reading like this. So this video has gotten very long. But I hope that the length of it will help you. Just watch the parts of it that you think will be useful as you start to figure out what you think you're going to do for your reading. Reread the book and make sure you have fun with this. This is supposed to be exhilarating. Let yourself experiment. I'm going to recognize it when you're experimenting and doing things that are legitimate from your own mind, and getting deep into the reading. I'm going to appreciate it. Even if it's a little bit wonky, it's okay. All right. Have fun. I'll see you in the next video.